You know, often when my friends learn of my friendship with Hamza and our collaboration together, I'll say a little bit about that before we begin our conversation. People will say something like, well, isn't it great? He's terrific. Isn't it great that he's such a good influence in the Muslim American community? Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, it's great that he's a great influence in the Muslim American community, as Rabbi Sachs is a great influence in the Jewish community, and Richard Newhouse was such a great influence in the Christian community. But like Rabbi Sachs and like Richard John Newhouse, Hamza is a person who transcends his own tradition, from whom Christians and Jews, and not just Muslims, can learn. I want Hamza to have an even greater influence, not just in the Islamic community, but in America, among Christians and Jews, people of every faith, and even those of no faith at all. So that's why it's such a very special honor for me. Hamza says equals no. With Hamza, I really feel, as with Richard, or when I'm with Rabbi Sachs, like I'm in the presence of greatness. Hamza and I have been able to work together on some projects, and I hope we'll work together on many more. We met, I think, Hamza can correct me if I'm wrong, we met when we got together at a very important conference that was hosted by the Witherspoon Institute on the social costs of pornography. For several generations now, it has been fashionable to say, and widely accepted, if not believed, if you catch my drift, that pornography, if it's a vice at all, is a private vice, not a vice that the public should be concerned about. But it turns out that pornography exacts from us enormous social costs. And so Hamza and I found ourselves gathered together with psychologists and psychiatrists, with counselors, with people who deal every day with the carnage left in the wake of the massive pornography industry that we now have in this country and more broadly. And Hamza gave on that occasion a remarkable, amazing speech, a philosophical speech, making a philosophical contribution, yes, from an Islamic point of view, as he should, but one that had lessons in it for me as a Christian, for our Jewish participants, for every single soul who was there, for our psychiatrists and our psychologists. We have so much to learn from each other. And listening to Hamza is the evidence for me of how much we have to learn from the great minds, the great thinkers in the Muslim community. Then a couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of inviting Hamza, and he accepted our invitation to come and speak at our annual Respect Life Sunday service in the Princeton University Chapel, the magnificent Princeton University Chapel. Princeton was founded by Presbyterians, but they must have been pretty high church Presbyterians. If you've seen our chapel, it looks like a great European cathedral. And for the past almost decade, we've been recognizing, observing Respect Life Sunday at a major interfaith service in the chapel. And Hamza was our first Muslim speaker at one of our services. He has now been, there's now a succession of them, including the great Susie Ismail, who gave a wonderful speech at our Respect Life Sunday service last year. But Hamza gave the most moving and profound speech that has been given at those services over the years. And I remember it so clearly. He began by chanting beautifully, so beautifully in Arabic, and then speaking in English for all of us to hear. It also introduced me to the status, the reputation that Hamza enjoys in the Muslim community. It's hard to fill the sanctuary of that chapel, but it was filled by Muslims who had heard that Hamza was going to be in town and preaching speaking at the service. And it was just a wonderful thing to see the esteem in which he's held by the Muslim community. So, have I flattered you enough, Hamza? Yeah.
I feel like such a fraud right now. I think I'm going to get arrested in a few minutes.
No, it's all true, and it's just such a pleasure to have my dear friend here with me. Now, since I'm in the David Frost role, I'd like to open our discussion, although Hamza, please say anything you like. I'd like to open it by going to the very foundations of our thought about religious freedom. Those of you who heard my philosophical treatment of the problem today will not be surprised that I think that at the foundations we find the concept of the dignity of the human being. We respect people's rights, including, in the very first place, the right to religious freedom, because we believe that every human being, irrespective of culture or class or religion, wealth, status, every human being has fundamental, inherent worth and dignity. No human being is a mere cog in the social wheel to be sacrificed for the sake of the state or the fatherland or the Führer or the people or even the faith. We believe that every human being is special and has dignity. Now, in the Jewish and Christian traditions, Hamza, we would understand theologically the dignity of the human being to be rooted in the belief that man, each of us, is made in the very image and likeness of God. This is taught to us in Genesis. Now, we can give a philosophical account because that fact of our being made in the image and likeness of God manifests itself in certain ways. I mean, after all, God, you can't say we're made in the image and likeness of God in the sense that God has 5 fingers on each of 2 hands and hair on his head and a nose. Right? No. Rather, we are God-like in our possession of the capacities, the powers for reason and freedom. Like God, we are capable of causing things. We have freedom. We're capable of causing things we're not caused to cause. We're capable of functioning, unlike brute animals, not simply on instinct or impulse, but by deliberation, judgment, and choice. But the account of that might be affirmed even by a secular person, but the account of why or how that is the case, not whether it's the case, that's clear, but how that's the case, is that scriptural teaching about man being made in the image and likeness of God. How would you address it theologically from the Islamic point of view?
Right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, the reason why we hit it off actually is because in my talk I quoted Randy Travis. and immediately I had a friend because Robbie, as you know, is a great bluegrass musician, and my brother is probably one of the best dobro players on the West Coast. So I grew up with bluegrass music, so we had all this immediate, the Stanley Brothers and Earl Scruggs and I actually knew too.
He keeps outing me.
He played a banjo tune for the whole audience that day, and I thought it was Earl's Breakdown, but he was so impressed that I just knew that it was a adjustable tuning that was going on. So
it was the Flint Hill Special.
Yeah, Flint Hill Special. So just this issue about the image of God, the imago. Right, that is really central to the Christian tradition. This is an area that the Muslim theologians dealt with a lot because of the anthropomorphism that is obviously one of the dangers in that idea. And as you mentioned, it's not the physical image because, as St. Thomas Aquinas and all the great Catholic theologians made it very clear that God was not limited in time and space. But in the Islamic tradition, there's a hadith that says that that God created the Ar-Rahman, the merciful, created man in his own image. And they have a lot of debate about what that tradition means. But the dominant opinion amongst classical Muslim theologians, and obviously there's some anthropomorphic traditions in Islam that in fact, what's called the Wahhabi or the Salafi tradition tends to have a very anthropomorphic idea about that tradition. And so they will argue that God's actually in the direction up. And they demand, I was once surrounded by a group in Saudi Arabia, I was in Medina, of young students, some of them were American students that were studying there. And they surrounded me demanding that I assert that God was up, like physically up there. And I said to him, I told them, I said, do you concede that the earth is round? And they said, yes. And I said, well, where do you point if you're on the other side of the planet? What do they do? And that definitely confused them a little bit. But the theologians argue that we're created in the metaphysical image of God. And there are 20 attributes that are considered necessary for God to believe that God, the one is aseity, which the Catholics assert also. The idea that God is a being unto himself. He does not need anything outside of his own essence to exist. And then the idea of firstness without beginning, lastness without, and it goes on. But the 7 attributes that of life, of sight, of hearing, that he's mutakallim, that God speaks. So sight, life, hearing, speech, and that he sees everything. The 7 attributes. The theologians argue that these attributes manifest in the human being as a way of approximating the understanding of God to man. That we know that God is all-seeing because he has limited our sight, and yet he can speak to us and tell us that he's all-seeing, and the fact that we have sight enables us to understand what that means. Even though, in mathematics they say any number over infinity is canceled out, and so any temporal attribute of a contingent being in relation to the atemporal reality of an absolute being that's not contingent is canceled out. So we can't say, we see, but we can't say we see like God. But when God says he is the all-hearing or the all-hearing or the omniscient, the all-powerful, we know what power is because we have been given this limited power, contingent power, that enables us to understand that concept. So the Muslims agree with the Jews and the Christians on that principle, but with that caveat that it has to be understood. We have the Christians call it, Catholics call it the via negativa, right?
Yes, that's right.
In theology, that we believe that it's easier to say what God is not than to say what God is. And the Muslim theologians say that anything that will occur to your mind, God is other than that. And so, in the end, there's the inconceivability of God for the human intellect, and in fact, there's a tradition the Prophet Muhammad said, never reflect on the essence of God, but reflect on the gifts that God has given you, the blessings. And we know that mathematicians like George Cantor, who attempted to even penetrate infinity, and most of these mathematicians have gone mad. I mean, literally, Cantor ended up in a straitjacket, that the human being cannot contemplate infinity, even an actual infinity, which mathematicians talk about, as opposed to an absolute. But God's essence is impenetrable for the human intellect. So,
the relationship between faith and reason.
right.
Now, in Christianity, there are a spectrum of views about that, as is true, I'm told by my friend Rabbi David Novak, within Judaism. But on the Catholic side of that spectrum, and also for some Protestants and for some Jews, it is thought that there is a fundamental harmony, and not only a harmony, but a mutual necessity of faith and reason, or revelation and reason. Pope John Paul II opens his great encyclical on faith and reason, called Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, right, with an image. He says that faith and reason are like 2 wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth. He worries, and this is very much in line with the Catholic side of the Christian tradition, that too great an emphasis and an overemphasis on reason leads to fideism. Right. And of course, an overemphasis on faith leads to fideism, the belief that what we can know, especially in the ethical domain, is limited to what God specially reveals. And if you make the opposite error, too great a faith in reason, you get rationalism, which ends up being reductive and turns on itself to eliminate the possibility of any knowledge at all. Do we find a spectrum within Islam on the question of the relationship of faith and reason? And from your own perspective as an Islamic thinker, how do you understand that relationship?
I think one of the major problems that happened a few years back when the Pope gave the famous talk.
The Regensburg.
Right, the Regensburg talk in Germany. And he was actually quoting one of the last emperors of the Byzantine before Istanbul, Constantinople fell. I think he was about 90 years before the fall. And he was quoting him about the irrational nature of Islam. And then he quoted a Muslim theologian, Ibn Hazm, who's an Andalusian theologian from the 5th Islamic century. And there's definitely been, as you know, in Christianity and in Judaism, there are strains that are anti-rational. And you find that within the Islamic tradition. And historically, the Muslims had a fundamental crisis between this idea of what they called naql and aql. Naql is what the revelation is that's transmitted, and aql is the intellect and how it grapples with the revelation. So reason and revelation, and the interchange between these two. And this became one of the fundamental debates in the early Islamic tradition. And there was a school called the Mu'tazilite, that are the rationalists, that argued that religion has to be consistent with reason at all times. And they took an Aristotelian position that if it could not be justified rationally, then we would reject it. And the counter to that were two schools. One was a traditionalist school that argued that reason doesn't have any place. We just simply accept what's been given to us, and the intellect will just lead us astray. This school was a very small minority school that now a modern version of that school is what we find, for instance, in some of the extremist traditions today, and certainly in some of the positions in Arabia. But I would not lump all of the Saudi scholars together. It's very dangerous to do that. There are some very enlightened Saudi scholars, even within what's called the Wahhabi tradition. They don't like to be called Wahhabis. But even within that tradition, and I have friends from that tradition, but some of those scholars it's unbelievable what they come up with because of their rejection of reason. Logic is forbidden in their school to teach. Whereas in the dominant strain of Islamic tradition, you have a balance. And they talk about the two wings also, of faith and reason, and the importance that, in fact, Fakhruddin al-Razi, one of the greatest theologians of Islamic history, there's a verse in the Quran called the light verse, and it said that God sends this revelation down, and then it says light upon light. And he argues that it's reason upon revelation, that if you don't have the light of reason to interact with revelation, you're blinded by the light of God, as opposed to guided by it. That you need your own reason to enable you to see with the light of God. That revelation without reason blinds you. It does not enable you to see the truth. And this becomes the dominant position, and this is what taught. I studied Aristotelian logic with West African scholars. I mean, they still are very committed to the Aristotelian tradition. They haven't really had the additions that Bacon or John Stuart Mill or others have added to the logical tradition, and they certainly have no idea of symbolic logic or some of the madness that modern logic has, And I'm not saying that flippantly. I mean, the fact that we've removed logic from even in law school. They no longer study in most law schools. They don't study formal logic, and to the inability to understand. The Arabs, what I was taught by one of my logical teachers, he said that the foundation of understanding he said it's first tasawwur, conceptualization, and then he said it's hukm, judgment, and then he said, and then it's reasoning with those two, that you need those two tools to do the third. And then he said, but the hukm is based on the ruling, the judgment about a thing is based on its conceptualization. And then he gave me this principle, al-hukmu ala shay'in far'un an tasawwurihi, which means before you can judge a thing, you must grasp and understand it in all of its understandable dimensions. And so this is the idea of really teaching people how to think, defining terms, understanding how we can reason. I mean, this is the great gift that we've been given, the ability to reason. Arguments. The Quran uses many arguments There's a book written by a great theologian, Imam al-Ghazali, called Qustas al-Mustaqim, which means the sound standard or balance. And he argues in there that he refutes those who rejected logic, saying that God himself uses reasoning in the Quran, usually in the form of enthymemes, right? But they are syllogistic in their basic structures. And so, you know, all of my teachers were very committed to a rational understanding. And the idea, like, you know, when I taught theology last year, and, you know, we read the traditional, the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, which is the great contribution of Muslim theologians, even now to Western tradition, because the primary book we used was written by a Christian scholar who used the Kalam cosmological argument because it's a very sophisticated form of the traditional cosmological argument. And so they were really struck by that. And when we dealt with the new atheists, I mean, the thing that I tried to point out was that the new atheists, their reasoning is so shallow. They're not. Nietzsche was a much better atheist than these modern. I mean, if you've ever read Nietzsche, Nietzsche was the only guy that ever, in my experience in reading, I felt like he grabbed my spine, my religious spine, and just shook it, you know. So
everything's gone to pot, including atheism. It was so much better in the 19th
Exactly.
century.
Yeah, no, much better atheists, much better theologians, and, you know, so we've now waxing nostalgic, you know, the past, you know. I mean, even Georgetown, look at the students, you know, seriously. And I tell I was at a college, because I teach at a junior college, I'm teaching a class with another teacher, and they were asking about, you know, oh, doesn't Saudi Arabia claim to be the only true religious state in the Muslim world? And I said, well, don't you all claim to be students? I mean, does a claim really mean anything? You know? I said, I know you're all smoking dope and doing your Game Boys, and you're not reading the books. We know. We can tell from the tests.
Being a Catholic, I'm not quite as strong on my scripture as I should be, but I believe, Mike Cromarty can correct me if I'm wrong, and will, I'm sure, that it's our common spiritual father, Abraham, who argues with God. He begins with a negotiation, right? About Sodom and Gomorrah, but he doesn't just negotiate.
That's in the Quran too, by the way. Yes.
He makes an argument.
He makes an argument.
Essentially
give me 10 righteous people.
Well, there's the bargaining, but then the argument is you wouldn't want it to be said of the God of all creation that he would do an injustice.
Yes.
You know, it's contrary to the nature of
Yeah, no, we have the same argument. Yeah.
At that Regensburg speech, which caused so much controversy, but also then I think generated
a lot of dialogue. I
actually
met the Pope because of it.
Yeah,
so
you were one of the 38.
I was. Yeah, we met. And he got like completely shocked because he was very gracious. He actually stayed on the same level as the Muslim interlocutor that represented the Muslims. So he wasn't raised on a dais. But he came down and greeted each one of us and really connected and spent like 30 seconds, you know, which is a lot of time when you're meeting the Pope, you know, 30 seconds.
Right.
But, you know, I was really struck, first of all, by how poorly he photographs, because he actually has a very soft face that really, when I met him personally, it really came through. But I told him, I said, listen, you know, I have a mother-in-law that I've got problems with because her daughter married me, and she's a Catholic, so I think I can solve this problem if you would just pray for her. and
never miss an opportunity.
And his eyes just lit up. They really did. And he said a prayer in Latin, by the way. So I had 4 years of Latin, so he said a prayer in Latin for her. And so when I told her that, I am just like Flynn. I have no problems. You know, I've solved all my problems. So she's Mexican Catholic, really devout Mexican American, but she's got a picture of me meeting the Pope that everybody that comes in the house, that's my son-in-law. I don't care if he's Muslim or what. So anyway,
the thing the Pope was concerned about, it's interesting the way the thing came up, the faith and reason issue directed toward the engagement with the Muslim world, if I'm recalling correctly. Of course, the debate over fideism within Christianity is a long-standing debate. The Reformation has a lot to do with that. But his concern, expressed concern, was that when religion is not, as he put it, purified, that's the term he used, at least is the translation into English, I believe he was speaking in German, was purified. That unless religion is purified by reason, it can degenerate into violence. So that's where that. So he sees reason as, lay aside the merits of the argument about Islam, but he sees reason as necessary to religion, as part of religion, and not something apart from it, for the sake of humane, compassionate values, peaceful values.
No, and I couldn't agree with him. I mean, he's absolutely right on that. Yeah. I think Asimov's remarked that violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, and that it's lack of reason that leads to that inability to deal with the problems. And I think what's happened in the Muslim world today, the social problems are so great. We're talking about religious freedom, right, which is a serious problem, and it is in the Muslim world, on a lot of different levels. Like he was talking about intra-religious debate, because within the Muslim community, there are people that actually will deal better with interfaith than they will with interfaith. Like they'll actually be able to talk to Christians and Jews with respect and mutual tolerance and
That's
dignity.
That's true in all religions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but it's a problem.
It is a problem in all religions.
It's a type of stupidity because, first of all, human differences, we will never agree. The Arabs, and Mutanabbi is a great Arab poet, he said, men will never agree on anything except that they disagree, and death. And then he says, but even in death they disagree, because some say the soul dies with the body, and others say the soul goes on after the body. So even in death men differ. So, this idea that we can somehow construct, and this is the utopian fantasy of every ideology, that we can kind of construct society in a uniform image. There's nothing in nature that's uniform. Nature it's not chaotic, but it's extremely diverse, and it has a chaotic element in it, I mean, from our perspective. So this idea that we have to regiment people, and I mean, I believe in a magisterium, I do. Like, I think that religion does need, because of the dangers inherent in religious belief, because nothing is done more heinous than when it's done in the name of religion, and it's very easy for good people to do evil things, has been noted by many people, because of religion. And so when you're dealing with religion, this is one of the issues with freedom of religion in the Muslim world. Jordan, I mean, I'm very familiar with the situation in Jordan. Jordan does issue a weekly sermon that all the imams give in the mosque, and every mosque has like a secret police in most of I would probably say almost all of the Muslim countries, monitoring the imams' statements. Now, part of that, for me, it's deeply troubling. I would like to see, like here, I'm able to get up and say whatever I want in the masjid. I mean, now we have FBI monitoring some of the masjids. But, generally, I'm not going to get, the FBI is not going to come and arrest me for what I'm saying. Like, they might mark down that, he said some things against the government or whatever.
But that would happen throughout the Arab world?
Well, in the Arab world, if you say certain things, and some of them, large parts of the Muslim world, you will end up in jail the same day if you say certain things. One of the things about Americans, and I think Western people in general, is this idea of freedom, how we define the term, because as you know, it's a very problematic term, especially as a legal theorist. The relationship between law and freedom is a very nebulous one, and
I've written a couple of books.
Exactly, yeah. And
in fact, they're on your reading list on your website, for which I thank you.
We have one of the great legal theorists in here too, Hadley Arkus. I mean, I would love to have him up here instead of me, but this idea, Mortimer Adler, who wrote the Syntopicon essays, and they identified, that University of Chicago project identified 102 great ideas, and freedom was one of them. When he founded the Institute of Philosophical Research back in the 50s, the first great idea that they decided to do, they never got beyond it because it took so long, but the first idea they decided to investigate was freedom. And they wrote a 2-volume work that I think maybe 1 or 2 people have read on freedom, but it was identifying the different types of freedom. You know, moral freedom. This country, we don't talk about moral freedom. You know, like the ability to be free to control your acrasia.
St. Paul.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, the ability to control. We have political leaders that lose their careers because they don't have moral freedom. They're unable to freely act. They submit to their own lower tendencies. Yeah. And so moral freedom is just absent from this talk about freedom. Freedom in America becomes licentiousness, and the idea that it's the freedom to do whatever I want as long as I don't hurt anybody. That's always the nice caveat, not recognizing that, for instance, in the case of pornography, we now know that there's a great deal of statistical evidence that indicates that people that engage in pornography over long periods of time end up in pedophilia. They end up watching pedophilic images on which, as you know, anybody in a society that wants to maintain the fabric of a society to hold it together has to be deeply concerned by evidence like that. And just say, look, this can't just be about what I do in the privacy of my home. We also know that a lot of the films are made by organized crime. A lot of the women that are in these films are actually in sexual slavery, which we have literally millions of people now engaged all over the world.
Came out in the conference.
Exactly. So, you know, there are deep issues about this. So when we look in the Muslim world, I understand in the Jordanian example that it used to be that scholars were allowed to say whatever they wanted. This was when the great teaching institutions of Al-Azhar, of Qarawiyyin, of Zaytuna, you know, that were producing these world-class scholars. And in the colonial period, a lot of these institutions broke down. Their funding was absconded. There was a lot of malfeasance. There was a lot of problems that came about. And these institutions lost their credibility. They became part of government control, and so Al-Azhar went under the government. It used to be an independent organization, but it went under the government, and so you got the scholars for dollars, the people that were, you know, they were being paid by the state, and they lost their independence and their freedom. But these men, and the women also that were involved in this, were people that were committed to a balanced, moderate tradition in Islam, recognizing that social order was extremely important. And so you had very responsible sermons on Friday. What happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when you got this transition to the weekend scholars because of the high literacy that emerges in the Muslim world. And suddenly you have people reading, as you know, St. Augustine wrote on Christian doctrine, arguing that the liberal arts was necessary, that you had to be a liberal artist to read the Bible. You have to know what a conditional sentence is. You have to know what the subjunctive mood is if you're going to read a book that purports to be from God. So if you haven't studied grammar, if you haven't studied rhetoric, if you haven't studied logic, then it's very dangerous to open up a book believing this is from God. Years ago when I did a rotation in an insane asylum. I wasn't in there as a patient. but I did a rotation in an insane asylum, and there was this guy he was a manic depressive, and he had a psychotic episode because he read in the Bible, stay awake and keep vigil. And he took it literally. And he stopped sleeping, and he went into this psychotic episode. So I was, you know, talking to him about this, and I said, did you ever think that might actually have been more like metaphorical, that it meant like stay awake and keep vigil, not all the time, but just when you're awake, and be aware that there's danger? And then he said, no, I didn't think of that, you know. And it was, this kind of light went off on this poor man. But we have people reading books that are very dangerous books. I mean, the Quran is a dangerous book. The Bible is a dangerous book. These are not easy books. And in the wrong hands, I think they cause an immense amount of harm. I mean, the metaphor that I would use is, you know, to use an economic metaphor, you know, we have externalities, right? So in economics, you have a company that will do something for a primary reason, but then it has these externalities. Now, there's positive externalities and negative externalities. So suddenly they're polluting the river, do you know? And then people downstream start having birth defects. Now, the people want that corporation responsible for those externalities. Well, we tend to forget that religion has externalities. You know, that there's toxic side effects of religion. And as religious people, I think we need to take more responsibility for the toxic externalities. I can't as an individual say, look, I'm responsible for bin Laden and what he did. But I have to acknowledge that there is a strain of thinking within the Islamic tradition that is incredibly dangerous. And if it's not marginalized, if it's not in the same way that we would deal with nuclear power, because religion is like nuclear power, it's incredibly clean, and it will illuminate houses at much cheaper and less harmful effects than petroleum and other energy sources. But it has toxic waste. And if you don't have some way of dealing with that, then you have meltdowns.
Never thought of that analogy.
Yeah.
We do want to have some time for Q&A, but there are two. I want to do a little lightning round with you first,
okay.
Hamza. I don't know if David Frost ever talked about lightning rounds, but there are two issues that I want
What's
to
the first
hear
thing you think when I
about.
say? That's
yeah,
what
right.
the poor candidates, you know, like, how would you describe yourself?
Right. Do you prefer deep dish or thin crust? But here are the questions. One has to do with the impact of Islam on America,
right.
and the other with America on Islam. So let's start in reverse order.
Okay.
That document that I referred to so frequently today in my prepared remarks, Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council, I believe was only made possible because of the American experience of religious liberty and the work of American thinkers, above all the Jesuit thinker John Courtney Murray, who for all I know might have been at Georgetown, I'm not sure. But anyway, it was a very distinguished Jesuit thinker who, for a while, was required by the church not to publish his work. He could continue doing it, but the church wasn't quite sure about this robust conception of religious liberty that he was advancing, not quite having yet disentangled their idea of religious liberty from French revolutionary ideology, which these European prelates associated it, not quite gotten hold of the American idea. But Murray, in the end, prevailed, and his prevailing wasn't the achievement of one man. It was really the transmitting of the experience of America with a non-French revolutionary version of religious liberty, one that was pro-religion, that was friendly to religion, that supported religion, that enabled the church to move from a limited and cramped idea of religious liberty to the robust idea. Is something like that, will the work of American Muslims and the experience of Muslims in America have that impact on Islam internationally?
I totally believe that. I mean, one of the most interesting things about Muslims in America is that for the first time, a lot of these immigrants have never had to build a mosque because the state does all this stuff where they come from. And so suddenly it's the idea, self-reliance, the American virtue becomes part and parcel of the Muslim immigrant experience in this country, of having to have fundraisers and do these things. Because in Muslim countries, it's all controlled by the state. And so the state builds the mosque, the state runs the mosque. I mean, there's still areas where that's not totally true. And I was in a few of them. But generally, that is the case. So there's an immense amount of strength that comes with this separation. And I mean, my own personal experience, I really believe this, that the conflation of state and religion is the worst thing that can happen to religion, because it deracinates religion of its spiritual sources. It really sterilizes the religion. It has a horrible effect on people, which is why you see so many people sleeping in these Friday sermons throughout the Muslim world. And then the passivity it creates, because people aren't forced to have to think about things.
Well, it hasn't done much for England to have an established church in recent years. I mean, that's certainly
England, I think it's such a unique, I think we underestimate the impact that having a world war on their continent had on them. I mean, we lost a lot of people. My father was a World War II veteran, and he came back, fortunately, but we lost a lot of people on the continent. All those cities were destroyed. I mean, people really, their faith was shaken to the core with World War I and then II. And they had devastating impact.
There's no doubt about that, but it seems that the people who are most eager to disestablish the Church of England are not the secularists and people who are hostile to religion. In very many cases,
the Anglican,
religious people
exactly,
who think
within,
that this
yeah.
is, well, they say what
Yeah.
you say, that it deracinates religion,
Yeah.
that it makes it
Yeah.
pro forma and so
Yeah.
forth. But then shifting now to the second, the impact of Islam on the United States. Catholics have had a major impact on the United States. Jews have had a major impact. Obviously, Protestants, the original European settlers, did. Muslims, and not just extremists, and not just Muslims abroad, although them too, but American Muslims do worry, especially raising their children, about this issue that you mentioned of licentiousness.
Okay.
Now, we don't hear a lot of, from you we do, but we don't hear a lot from others about these kinds of moral issues.
Right.
And I think that's probably because, as was the case with other minorities in the past, especially recent arrivals, they are very concerned with prejudice against them, with dealing with being in a new place, with wanting to seem as though we're not outsiders, we're not hostile, we're not dangerous. But my hope is, and your own work leads me to think this hope is a reasonable one, is that Muslims will join with Protestants and Catholics and Jews who are faithful in the moral renewal of our culture. Is that a reasonable hope?
First, I want to just take a historical stab. Who would you say was the most influential philosopher on the Founding Fathers? On
the Founding Fathers?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. The standard answer to that question is Locke. But when Jefferson wrote his famous letter to Henry Lee in 1823, near the end of his life, he said that he drew the inspiration, the content of the Declaration of Independence, not from any one thinker, but from, Hadley can help me here, the standard books of political right, and then he listed 4 or 5 names and then said, et cetera. And they were Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, Locke, etc.
This is the problem with asking an academic a question, because he was just supposed to say John Locke. Okay.
Well, this is a lightning round, so Locke.
Yeah, okay, so John Locke. A lot of people don't know that John Locke actually wanted to do Islamic studies, and that one of his main influences was Edward Pocock. And the Pocock Library is in Oxford today, with 400 Arabic manuscripts, because Pocock was his teacher at Oxford, and Pocock had studied in Syria for several years and actually became a scholar, a notable Muslim scholar. I'm not a Muslim scholar, but a notable scholar of Islam. He was a Christian when he returned, and one of the things that he promoted was Unitarianism, which is why Locke converts to Unitarianism, and he also promoted toleration because he thought that the Muslims had really solved the problem of religious plurality.
This is Pocock.
Pocock, yes.
And Locke had a more limited tolerance.
No, absolutely. But I think the impact that he had on Locke is real. And so I think the Islamic tradition has had an impact already, and it's an area that needs a lot of research and investigation, but I think there's room for that. In terms of the modern situation, one of the things that's so striking is wherever you go now, you will see Muslims in some of the best universities in the United States, and I know you've got several students yourself. A lot of them are very committed to a moral life. They might not be, as devotional, as a really committed Muslim would be, but they're raised in environments with usually very strong family, solid families. The divorce rate is much lower in the immigrants than it is in the community at large. And I think they're going to really begin to have major impacts because they've just got so many advantages over a lot of the... and in many ways, I think we mirror a lot of the Jewish community's experience in the United States. So a lot of the I always tell the Muslims now, like, first of all, you don't know what persecution is, so don't say you're persecuted in America. I mean, we've got some troubles and we need something, but this idea that we're a persecuted minority is absolutely absurd. I think there's been some egregious mistakes made in law enforcement and things, undeniably, but overall, it's a fallacy to say that, because they don't know the history of this country, and that's one of the things I try to remind people, that every minority community that has come here has been bitten, and had a difficult time, which is why they tended to call the source of those stings wasps, because they really saw that as kind of, you had to assert yourself. The Irish Catholics had to do it. They were not part of that Anglican, Protestant community. The Italian Americans had to do it, and they're still dealing with the terrorists. I mean, we forget, wops, dagos, kikes, niggers, spics, greasers. My Irish great-grandfather changed his name. My Greek grandfather's name was Demetrius Georgiopoulos, and he becomes James George, right? And he was light-skinned.
See, we're related. I knew we were related.
He was light-skinned, and he had to tell people that he was from France. And this is like 30s and 40s in America, So I think we've come a long way. And I think the Muslims and the Hindus and the Buddhists now are the new kids on the block, because they aren't part of the European, because the Eastern European migration to this country was a radical change from the past. I mean, at the turn of the 20th century. And a lot of the anarchists that came over, and I mean, it's a very interesting period. So the Muslims they're here, and they're here in larger numbers. We just had a report that was released that did a study. I mean, the growth in mosques in the last 20 years is 79%. There's now almost 3,000 mosques. There's more mosques here than there are in Jordan, if that quote today was accurate. We now represent one of the largest minority communities of Muslims in the world. There are several Muslim countries that have smaller numbers. Mauritania is an example. And yet we don't have representation on the Hajj. All of the Muslim countries have Hajj representation. We now send more people to Hajj than most of the Muslim countries. We send 17,000 people a year to Hajj. There's still no quotas on Muslims to Hajj from America, because all the other countries have quotas, because they can only take about 3.5 million people maximum, and they get so many requests. So the Muslims, Keith Ellison is actually trying to get some kind of representation from this community so that they can meet with the king and petition, right? The right to petition, for the necessities of the American Hajis. So I personally think there are many areas where Muslims are going to increasingly impact the country. I mean, for instance, what we're trying to do in California with the Zaytuna College, I mean, I'm really trying to get back to a kind of, it's almost like an 18th century, early 19th century ideal of a liberal arts college in the United States. Swarthmore is a good example, what you went to. I mean, I think that you should have, just like you have pre-med, you should have pre-law in a liberal arts college, instead of churning out these lawyers that have no philosophical understanding of the real issues about law, like positivism and natural law theory, and really thinking deeply about these issues. They end up becoming specialists that know a little bit about a subject that needs to have a generalist understanding. If you're going to specialize in law, if you don't have a generalist understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of law, and these are ancient problems. I mean, religious freedom, we're talking about Antigone is where we can argue about religious freedom in a liberal arts college. If you read Antigone, the same issues are there when the state impinges on the right for people to practice their religion. We, as moderns, we're so, arrogant in the assumption that these are new problems,
Yeah, Cornell West and I in our seminars always begin we have lots of different readings, we change it in different ways, but we always begin with Antigone.
Great.
Well, okay, let's open the floor. Yes, Professor Bradley.
I'm Jerry Bradley from the University of Notre Dame. That's a school in the Midwest that was formerly a football powerhouse. Well, my question has to do with Robbie's favorite text, which is Dignitas Humanae. And it may seem paradoxical after all that's been said today, and including this evening, to say that the right of religious liberty that's affirmed there by the Council Fathers, based, as Robbie says, I think quite rightly, in light of the American experience with freedom of religion, not so much specifically, I think, Murray's theological writings and arguments, but the American experience, I think, had a lot to do with Dignitas Humanae. But it's actually, although a basic human right and a big deal, and the reason why we're here today, freedom of religion is actually derivative. It's not foundational. It comes from something else. And you look at the first part of Dignitas Humanae, it's easy to see that the something else is a moral duty.
Right.
It's the moral duty to the truth. Each one is required to seek out the truth about matters religious and to adhere to that truth which he or she finds. And my question is to you, Sheikh Hamza, is there a counterpart notion, parallel notion, or something like that in the Islamic tradition where you have this, now these are my own terms to describe this phenomenon in Dignitas Humanae, you have this foundational commitment to the truth, whatever that happens to be.
Yes.
And Catholicism comes in a little bit later. Is this overriding moral duty of each one to what's true part of the tradition in Islam? Because if it is, then you have the sort of the resources to develop a critical theology.
Yeah.
And you really have the opening to move philosophy and reason, Benedict would say, into a kind of consortium with the Islamic theological tradition.
No, and it's been there. I mean, our theologians were very committed to that idea that faith had to be based on reason, that, they were very troubled by circular reasoning. They call it dawr wa tasalsul. I mean, we studied these things in our theological training, that you can't argue. The Quran has to be proven, to be true rationally. So there's all these books written making rational proofs of why it's revelation. There's all these, because they needed to ground it in that. And so I think that's foundational to the understanding that you had to have faith and reason, and that component was so important. And also, there's no verses in the Quran where any coercion is mentioned about. The Quran states clearly in chapter 18, فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Whoever wants to believe, let him believe. It literally says, فَلْيُؤْمِنْ, let him believe. And whoever wants to disbelieve, فَلْيَكْفُرْ, let him disbelieve. And then the Prophet Muhammad, it was said to him in the Quran, can you compel people to be believers? In the second chapter of Baqarah, it says that there can be no coercion in the religion, that reason is clear from unreason or error, that the reason, it's clear, this is clear. So you can't force people, let them think about this. Even in the chapter where they say about killing people in Surah At-Tawbah, which is the 9th chapter, and this is always quoted by people saying that Islam is violent. It says to kill the polytheists wherever they are. And that verse, which is in that chapter, that verse was a time-specific verse because the polytheists had broken the treaty with the Muslims. They had a treaty, and they had broken it by killing Muslims. And then they went to Mecca, which was a sanctuary at that time, and they had captives, and it was permission to fight in the sanctuary. That was not a universal thing to, I mean, isn't this what you were taught? This is what we were taught. And then it says immediately after that, but if one of them wants to hear the word of God, let him hear the word of God. And then it says, and if he decides not to believe, then take him to a safe place and leave him alone. Right? So, this is this decontextualization and idiotic people, quoting. I mean, I had one of my teachers, somebody got up in a lecture and quoted this verse in the Quran that says, whoever doesn't judge by God, he's a disbeliever. And he said to him, which chapter is that in? He said, I don't know. And he said, what was the verse before it so I can know the context? He said, I don't know. He said, what was the verse after it? He said, I don't know. He said, what do you do? He said, I'm a mechanic. He said, fix cars. Like I said, these books are dangerous books. And you have to have a scholastic tradition that is able to navigate these meanings. So, the Prophet ﷺ nobody during his lifetime was killed for apostasy, nobody. And there are apostasy laws, just like in Catholicism. You can find in church canon law, you can find apostasy laws. There are apostasy laws. There's one hadith that they base these on, But there are other hadiths, and they weren't in agreement upon this. One of the greatest scholars of Islam, Atta, did not believe that there should be any capital offense in apostasy. Now, the idea, and you know, in our Supreme Court in 1955, there was an argument, and you know much better than I do, about, I think it was about polygamy, which, you know, that...
The polygamy case was back in the 19th century, the Mormon polygamy case called Reynolds.
But which was the one where it was said the freedom to, that religious freedom is the freedom to believe and to, but not necessarily the freedom to act.
Oh, what was that?
Well, the Jehovah's Witnesses case from 1940 says that.
Yeah, it might have been.
Gabitis and Barnett.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, that, obviously, there's a lot of room for interpretation on what that means, right? Sure. But traditionally, many people did not believe in Islam. And I guarantee you, there are many people in the Muslim world that do not believe in Islam. But they don't go out into the society and declare these things, not necessarily because, you know, they can't do it, but because they understand that this will really affect the social fabric. That, you know, first of all, people end up losing the whole, you know, marriage, all these things, because in Islamic law, if you're, you know, a Muslim woman cannot marry a non-Muslim man by law, and a Muslim man, although he can marry a Jew or a Christian woman, is not encouraged to do so, but he has that dispensation. And so, you know, the other thing that's very problematic in Islamic tradition, and I have to say this, you know, to full disclosure, the Islamic tradition is not amenable to the same degree that other traditions are to reformation. The reason for that is the Islamic tradition actually sees itself as a reformation of the Jewish and Christian sectarianism. Throughout the Quran, there are verses that say, do not turn into sects like the Jews and the Christians did before you. Right? And you know, I mean, the Middle East was filled with Jacobites and Nestorians and Syrian Orthodox and Catholics and Coptic. I mean, all these sects, right, were there. So, and there are many verses saying, don't change your religion after it's been given to you. So it's much more difficult for us to deal with it. And that's why we have to find the sources from our tradition, and they're there. That's the beauty of the tradition. Those sources are there. Those dissenting opinions are there. And those dissenting opinions need to be brought to the forefront, because right now they're in the background. And that's something, you know, we're sitting under these Babylonian bricks worrying about them falling on our heads. But we tend to just forget about things in the background when we're so focused on the foreground. But very often in religious thinking and tradition, we have to look at the richness of the tradition and bring things that in the past have been in the background and bring them into the foreground. And this gives it a much stronger basis for convincing Muslims around the world about, and this is what I try to do, you know, find those sources. I have Muslims all the time saying, I can't believe that. I say, it's right there. It's, you know, here's the hadith. You know, look, that the Prophet ﷺ said that. I mean, the Prophet said once, he said, none of you, this is a sound hadith in Imam Ahmad's Musnad. This is very important amongst Muslims, whether the hadith is sound or weak. This is a sound hadith, so it has authority. But, you know, it says that none of you truly believes until you have mutual mercy. And one of the companions said, all of us are merciful. He said, no, it's not the mercy a man shows to his friend. It's rahmatul amma, universal mercy. Mercy for all of creation. And it's not just, it includes animals. The Prophet was very concerned about harming animals. I mean, how can you have a religious tradition that can blow up people, you know, on buses and little children and things like that, and you're not allowed to kill frogs? Yeah. I mean, it's just so weird, you know, this modern madness.
Time for one more question, and it's Professor Arcus.
I get it. Is this on?
Yep. Yeah. Yep.
Well, in that case, we'd say we could raise the money, but it would be wrong for sure. Yeah. Now, I wish I could take Hamza back to Amherst with me, but I've given up Amherst for Lent. Tom made a remark today about that the understanding of religion is distinctly human. It reminded me of Chesterton's line that animals have no religious sense. When's the last time you heard a cow give up grass on Fridays? You know. I want to take this back to something that must be embedded in what we're arguing today. I was taken by that passage in the new book about religion being working out a relation to the harmony of the universe. And I thought it would be useful to make a contrast with Madison's understanding, reflected in Stephen Field. What do we mean by religion? Our relations to the creator of the universe and the duties that we owe him. Now, of course, some of the things that advertise themselves as religion seek to get a liberation from duties. Duties is a distinctly moral term. And you know, years ago with Father Newhouse, Robbie was there, we used to have seminars of people litigating on these questions, Mike McConnell, Doug Laycock, and they were offended when we raised the question, well, how do you understand a legitimate religion? You have these prostitutes in San Francisco forming coyote, call off your old tired ethics. If they claim to be a religious sect, do you have any ground for resisting them? Robbie referred to Nostrata and the concern by seeking the truth, accepting the truth in religion. Well, of course, you imply now that we have access to standards of reason by which we could gauge the difference between claims that are true or false, plausible or implausible. There's a concern for an upright life. I presume we reject Satanism. The point I'm trying to make is that we are folding into our understanding of religion standards of reason. Remember, Robbie was citing Abraham negotiating with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. Shall the God of the universe not himself be just? Remember, we had this conversation with David Novak. He said, it's all revelation. Well, what was Abraham saying to God? You don't understand your own revelation? He said, well, you've got to be reasonable, David said. Ah, yes, we have to be reasonable. Right, we're appealing to standards of reason. So now, we've seen sects in upstate New York, the Universal Congregation of seeking to simply affirming as a doctrine of belief their exemption from the taxes that are imposed on real estate, so they can be on the same plane with claimed by other religious institutions in the area. We might see in the aftermath of the Hosanna Tabor case a new sect claiming that they too, the main doctrine is that they wish to be exempted from the regulations that apply from the EEOC to matters of hiring and firing, right? And we said then when they want to call everybody a minister who works for them, and at some point we need something to say to them. So what I want to suggest to you is this: does this not all get back to us to the God of the Logos, the God of reason? The God mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, the author of the laws of nature, nature's reason about moral things. So I put this to Sheikh Hamza. What would you say in response to this question when somebody says, don't we have here a stance, an understanding that does not make us vulnerable to any group animated by passion that comes forth to declare itself to be a religion and gives us grounds of judgment? What do your own advice on that?
You know, I mean, you know very well that we're down the, you know, we're Alice, you know, fallen into the hole, and we're in Wonderland. I mean, everything's been. I felt so sorry for Robbie today. He doesn't feel sorry for himself because he deals with it all the time, but. You know, the woman who asked about the marriage and you know, this idea of trying to reason from natural law, not a religious argument, but a natural law argument that uses reason. And a lot of these people will simply say, but I'm not rational. You know, that I don't believe in rationality. These are Dionysian people. They're not Apollonian, and they want the Dionysian world to be the dominant world. This is our argument. You know, we need to you know, I recently read a book. It's a beautiful book, All Things Shining. I don't know if anybody read it in here, but you know, one of the things that they're arguing is trying to find meaning in a secular age, right? But they talk about this kind of just like how Helen was honored by the gods, and that the gods were the ones that seduced her away, and that it wasn't like a betrayal of the marriage bed. It was her recognizing the moment, and Paris sweeping her off. And there was this kind of celebration of the Dionysian spirit in this book that really intrigued me. But I think we're dealing with this today in the United States, that people don't understand where we're headed. And if you, Toynbee studied 21 civilizations and showed very clearly how they fell. And they fell the way we're falling right now. It's quite troubling. And so this country has a lot of strength and power in it, and I think there are possibilities for renewal, but we're entering into a post-Abrahamic period in the West that's deeply troubling. And I think the Founding Fathers, they certainly got some things wrong, but they got a lot of things right. And they understood things from the perspective that you're arguing from that is no longer the perspective. I mean, we've got moral relativism is the dominant force in our schools and universities today. And even though the sad thing about it is that a lot of these professors are not absolute skeptics and they're not total moral relativists, but they teach in a way that hints at that. And these students, that's what these young, impressionable minds go away with. And so, I told this class there that if anybody says to you there are no absolutes, you have to see the paradox of the statement, that they are articulating an absolute. And I think it's one of God's jokes on us that we can't deny absolutes without using an absolute. So I don't know. I really don't have an answer to that. Hey, I wish I did. But I'm troubled about the way all these things are going. And like you said, we've got religions, new religions cropping up. There's magazines that say how to start your own religion. That was Udne Reader had a cover story, how to start your own religion. And a lot of young people say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. So they don't want this idea of any organized religion. I always tell them to join the Islamic religion. We're the most unorganized religion out there. So.
Well, I'll confess that when I heard a few years ago, as we all did, Woody Allen's response when he was exposed as having taken up in a relationship with his wife or girlfriend's daughter, Sun Yi, as I recall her name. I remember when he responded to that, not with any defense, not with any apology, not with any resolve to do better, but simply by saying, the heart wants what the heart wants. I'll confess that my reaction to that was to think, we're doomed.
Yeah.
But in a cheerier moment, I think that while everything you say is certainly true, and this is how the great civilizations fell, I think there's still hope.
There is.
For this great experiment
we have
in
children.
ordered
I mean,
liberty. We have hope. We have to hope.
We have to hope.
And our hope, it seems to me, and I'll conclude with this, and it's why, Hamza, I have such esteem for you and what you're doing. Our hope is in people of goodwill, believers in the great truths of the Declaration, joining together across the lines of historic theological division and standing as brothers.
Yeah, we need an alliance of faith.
Yeah, that's right. Faith in God and faith in reason.
Yes.
Because you notice they're both being undercut.
Yeah, they're both being undercut completely.
Yeah. Tom, thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank our guests.